Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. Today we are talking about something that is important for everybody, which is things you can do to prolong the life of your drum heads, whether it's bass drum heads, toms, snares. We're going to talk about all of it. Bottom line is drum heads cost money and we have to replace them sometimes. So anything we can do to prolong the life and get the most time out of those heads, it just kind of makes sense to do. And they're not like a huge investment, but if you find yourself going through them pretty fast, it can start to rack up, and it's worth figuring out little things that aren't really going to affect your playing experience that much, that are going to cause them to just last longer and sound good for longer and remain tunable above all else. And thank you again to our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario, for helping us out. Today we're doing acid jazzes again for a couple of reasons that we're going to get to a little bit later. Okay, so first off, let's talk about toms, because I think they're the ones that are most susceptible to these issues. Now, when you're hitting a drum, the angle that you're striking the drum at is going to affect a lot of things. The tension of the head is going to affect a lot of things. And, frankly, how hard you're hitting it too. But the bottom line is there's a sort of a formula for maximum amount of life out of a drum head, and it sort of goes like this. If they're tuned really low, it's going to shorten the life of the drum. If they're at a very steep angle to you and you're striking the drum at a very steep angle, that's also going to shorten the life of the drum. And then the last thing is, if you're going through a lot of different, really extreme tunings, ultimately the whole head as a unit is going to stretch out faster than if you had a tuning you liked and you basically kept it there and restricted the damage to the head to just where you're striking it. Let's start off with the one that I remember from when I was a kid that came up all the time, and it was the angle of the drum. My technique wasn't good. I didn't want to hit the rim when I hit the tom, and I also didn't really know about good seat height for myself. So, I was sitting down here and I was angling my toms toward me so I could hit them. I was a smaller person at the time, which meant that I had to sit very low because of the size of my body. But what this results in is you're not hitting the toms flat. You're coming down on them and hitting them at a very steep angle. And what that means is that the force isn't going straight into the head, it's hitting it at kind of a steep angle. Basically what we're talking about here is denting. And it can happen if your snare is super low, it can happen to any of your drums, but basically what we want to be doing is hitting the drums as flat as we can while still being comfortable. For a lot of us, what that's going to mean is raising our wrists a little bit and imagining that we're hitting from a straight line like this rather than from a lower line like this, because that means that you're going to be connecting with the rim if you're coming in like this, which is what I was trying to avoid when I was younger. And in the end, the flattest hit you can get is going to have the least sort of inflection damage to the head. It's going to distribute the force evenly across more of the drum head. And in the end, it's also going to be a better sound because you're transferring more energy. So if you're looking for a fat fundamental or a lot of volume, hitting at a steep angle is really just going to ruin that for you. And it'll make you hit harder and harder and harder and destroy your heads faster. All right, so the next thing up is the floor tom. I think the prime sort of offender situation with the floor tom is that we want to get a low sound out of it, and that means tuning super low, like maybe just above a wrinkle, maybe there is a wrinkle in it. And what that is going to result in is the head is having a really hard time accepting the energy that the stick is putting into it. And that means that a bunch of it's going to come back to your hand, and a lot of it is just going to sort of penetrate the head and cause a lot of damage really fast. And in my experience in studio situations where we were needing to use a very low tuning, the life of the heads was cut like more than in half. And the thing that happens is that as they get beaten at that low tension and you start to tension them up, you don't have a good sound there either because you've blown out the edges and you've also blown out the center. And I find that super low tuned toms and floor toms especially tend to go hand in hand with pretty heavy handed playing because they don't do much at a low dynamic, but they do a really awesome thing at a really aggressive dynamic. That means that if you love that sound and you love that tension, you are going to go through those heads pretty quickly. But if you can stand to bring some muffling into the equation and bring the tension up just a little bit from that wrinkle or just above a wrinkle range, you're going to get a lot more life out of your drums. And if you're finding yourself playing a 14 and pitching it as low as you can, you probably could stand to look into a 16. I know people that have gone from 16s to 18s for the same reason, because they want a big sound. And as stated also in previous videos, when you're tuning that low, you're getting very little projection. So that means that unless you're being close mic'd or you're in a real small room, pitching it up a little bit is also going to be a good sound choice. Third in line, snare drum. All the stuff that we said about the toms applies to the snare drum, whether it's about head tension or angle, all of those things. But for me, even more so, the angle thing has a lot to do with your sound. One of the reasons that I got into playing traditional grip when I was young was for being able to adjust the angle of attack, like playing jazz and playing different things. But in the end, the big sound is a flat to the drum sound. If you're playing at a steep angle, you're just getting less out of it because some of the energy is getting kind of washed away. And it's worth noting also that, a lot of times here you see fresh heads on these drums for demonstrations and for comparisons and things like that. I brought my drum today just to sort of demonstrate and explain that I don't change my heads all the time. I change my Resos more often than batters, to be totally honest. But this head's been on this drum for months. It's got stuff written on it. It's got coating missing. It's got a lot of brush junk on it, some marks from setting drinks on it, all sorts of stuff. And it still sounds great to me for two reasons. One is that I have been hitting it flat the whole time. And two is that I haven't moved it from super low to super high a bunch of times like I was saying with the toms. So what that results in is a head that's going to last a little bit longer than if you were doing all of those things. I do still hit it really, really hard, and it doesn't sound like it did when it was new, but it still sounds really good. The most vulnerable head in the whole kit is the snare side head, and that's because it's super thin, and it also kind of gets ignored because we're never really looking at it. Tapping on it with a stick when you're tuning it, even if you don't see it, it is putting dents in that very, very, very thin film. The one that I see the most is people setting it on the snare stand and missing one of the claws and having the claw hit the bottom of the head. I've also seen people crack snare side heads, which is crazy and a real bad idea. But the thing that you may notice when you go to change your snare side head is that when you reduce the tension, you'll discover all kinds of little marks and dings and lines and dents and stuff throughout it that are invisible when it's tensioned, but that are involved in the sound of that head. So that's part of the reason why I change the snare head more often, really. If you're hitting super hard, you might have to change them both more often, but the snare side head isn't necessarily going to show you visually how wrecked it is, and you may change your batter head thinking that there's something wrong with it, and it might actually be underneath. Finally, the bass drum. There are a bunch of things that go into your bass drum sound beyond just the tuning of the drum. The beater angle, the relationship between the heads, how much muffling's inside of it. It is the drum that gets muffled the most normally of any of the parts of the kit. And a lot of these things can really dramatically affect the lifespan of the batter. The Reso side, I've had bass drum Reso heads for years and had them still be pretty useful and sound certainly good enough, especially for like modern pop kind of situations where you're not relying on a ton of resonance from the front head. However, one thing to think about is if you have a ported front head, the port itself is the weak point in that head. And if it's not reinforced or if it's poorly reinforced, you can tear that head just by like sort of haphazardly putting a mic inside of the drum. I've seen it happen on gigs. It's happened to me on gigs. Almost every backline drum set I've ever played has had some kind of tear in that port from trying to ram a mic stand in there that like wasn't low enough or whatever. So anything you can do to make sure that there is some reinforcement around there is definitely helpful. There are products for that, and most heads that come ported from the factory have some kind of help around that area to make sure that it's not going to just tear right through. Now, getting back to the batter, every bass drum batter that I have broken in my life, which was maybe, I don't know, a handful of them, they were definitely my fault and were definitely for one of the following reasons. These include playing very hard and burying the beater on a drum that's tuned very low. Adding to that, using a hard beater or a beater that has some kind of edge to it. And then lastly, not using any kind of reinforcement at the impact zone if I'm going to be playing in that manner. Now, if you play off the bass drum head all the time, the chances of you really breaking it are not so likely, because that pressure of impact is the thing that does the most damage to that head. If you're thinking about beater choice, your beater choice is going to affect the sound, obviously, but it is also really going to affect the lifespan of the strike zone on the head. And felt is kind of the middle ground. There are fluffy beaters out there, there's plastic and there's wood, but the main thing to think about is how is that impact getting distributed onto the head? It's the same thing as with the toms and the snare. If it's coming in at a very steep angle, you're getting a very small zone of attack that's going to get a lot more stress than the rest of it. If it's hitting nice and flat, it's getting distributed. If you're using a beater like a small wood or plastic beater that has kind of an edge to it anywhere, or frankly, if your DW beater that, we've all used at one time or another has the felt worn down, the edges of plastic around that felt are going to start to bite into the head. And these are things to just keep an eye on, because if you're playing all the time, they can sneak up on you, especially if you've been like, oh, that thing's been fine for 10 years. You should have a look at it, because it might be starting to get a little dicey. And it's a real shame that some of these things, especially with the beater damage, they can happen to a fairly new head, if there's something sharp on the beater that could be getting into the plastic that way. So the first thing to do is to just check the status of your beater, make sure that there's anything funny going on with it. The next thing to do is make sure the thing is hitting as flat as possible on the bass drum head. If it's coming in at a steep angle, that's going to affect things regardless of the beater material. And then number 3 is what to do to reinforce that area if you're really, really getting into that drum and stomping on it hard. There are patches. Many companies, including Evans, provide them when you buy bass drum heads in the box. There are aftermarket things. There are Danmark discs. There's all sorts of stuff like that that are designed around the idea that you're really going to be hitting this thing and you want that head to last for a while. I remember seeing Todd Zuckerman saying that as soon as he started using Danmark discs, they weren't breaking bass drum heads anymore. They were just changing them out every 6 months, like to be safe, on tour, like playing 300 shows a year or whatever. So these types of things really do make a difference. And bass drum heads are expensive. They're big, so you want that thing to last as long as possible. Now, the last thing is know your stick tip for the type of music you're going to play. Setting aside all of these other settings, there are pros and cons to every kind of stick tip, and they can really define how your heads age and also the sounds that you're making. I think most people choose them for a feel or a sound, but it does affect things. And today we're going to be talking about what is actually my favorite stick tip, which is round tips. I like them on thin hickory sticks like this one here. I like them on SD2s. I like them on orchestral sticks. But the thing about a round tip that is the great part and also the troublesome bit is that they're very articulate because they're hitting a very small amount of whatever thing you're striking, and that gives you that beautiful articulation and allows you to get a lot of great stuff out of cymbals and drums without having them open up too much at lower dynamics. Now, the flip side of that is that if you are really hitting with these, that impact zone is very small. And just like the bass drum beaters, you're putting a ton of force into a very, very small place. And if your drums aren't super flat and if they're tuned super low, you can put visible craters in the head right out of the gate, even a 2-ply head. There are variables here, and the stick tip is actually kind of a big one. So being cognizant of your choices where that is concerned, both, well, maybe primarily in terms of sound, but also if you're in a position where you want your heads to last for a while, which I think is most of us. If you know you're going to be hitting hard, switch it out, which I definitely do. I keep 5 Bs with a big tip in my bag, and I use them maybe 20% of the time. But when they're the right thing, they're the right thing. And maybe the rest of the time, you can use your favorite, whatever it is. But knowing the effect of these little variables is just going to make everything easier for you and is also going to make your head last longer. So to sum up, maybe the last thing that is worth mentioning about this is choosing the right heads for what you're going to do. Because being sort of psychoacoustic about it and saying, I should have this or I should have that, may get you into trouble. And realizing that these are tools to make a sound, and understanding what the right tool is, or at least the most effective tool is for the music that you're going to make, makes a huge difference. And, it's led me to the things that I use. It's led everyone here to the things that we use. And we are all just, in the end of the day, after a sound and a feel. And whatever works for you is totally fine. But I wouldn't necessarily play hydraulic heads on a jazz gig, but I do have them for when I know that I need that sound. And likewise, keeping some kind of faux calf around, and then also knowing what your middle ground is, which for me is G12s on everything. That's a personal thing, and you'll know pretty quick if it's going to work or not. And if you're thrashing heads, or if they're too thick and you're not getting a great sound at the dynamic you're playing, make sure that you keep in mind that there's a degree of ease in having the right stuff. And a little bit of experimentation goes a really, really long way to making sure that playing is easy for you and you can just kind of get to the creative place without a lot of stuff in between. All right, thanks so much for watching. I know this was kind of a long chatty one. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and click that little notification button so you get the notifications when we post a new video. Thanks again to ProMark by Dodaro for being our presenting sponsor. And let us know if you have any experience destroying drum heads, or if you're one of those guys out there that hasn't changed them for years.